Welcome to Citizen University TV. I'm Eric Liu. On this show, we've been looking at strategies of citizen power, and over the arc of our season, we've been studying 9 strategies that change the game, the story, and the equation of power in civic life. Today, we're going to focus on the last of these, which is performing power. Now, what do I mean by that? When I say performing power, I mean 3 things. In the first place, it means striking poses individually and collectively that shift the equation of power. Secondly, it means activating creativity and making art that generates new power. And finally, it means remembering that a motivated minority can always shift the balance of power in civic life. Let's start with power poses. You know, our little icon here is standing in a pose that psychologists call the Wonder Woman pose. And when you do this, and I invite you actually to get up and do it, stand up, put your hands on your hips, take a deep breath, you realize, wow, I feel better about myself. I feel stronger. I feel more capable. And that notion of striking that pose that actually allows you to almost fake it till you make it is true not only at the individual scale, but collectively as well. And not only of poses like standing up, but actually in this case, falling down. This is an image of a die-in that happened recently at Seattle City Hall, in which activists and everyday citizens decided all at once to fall to the ground and act as if they were dead. And what was the point of this? It was to dramatize the reality, often obscured, that over the course of recent months, dozens of homeless people have died in the city of Seattle without notice and without attention. And this theatrical performance here of power, striking this pose, actually got people's attention. It got the media, it got folks in policy-making positions to notice this in a different way. I think this kind of striking of a pose is incredibly important. Another example of this is Indivisible, the organization that sprung up in the wake of the Trump election of people all around the United States in congressional districts organizing and mobilizing to put pressure on their members of Congress to resist a Trump agenda. This is an example of Seattleites at an Indivisible meeting outside the federal building here. But whether it's in places like this, in public squares, or at town hall meetings of congressional members, Indivisible folks have been creating theatrical gatherings where they come together, they apply pressure, they make noise, and they strike a pose of power that has begun to shift what people think is possible in Washington, D.C. The next example, the next way that we think about performing power is this notion of making art, then power. What do I mean by that? Well, we think about making art often as this individual, solitary, genius endeavor, somebody at their easel just doing their work. But of course, that's never been true. And when you think about how art can infect or affect the way that things unfold in the public square and civic life, you realize, wow, this is a way in which creativity gets expressed in all kinds of transformative ways. If you reflect upon the Women's March and the science marches and how those weren't just mass gatherings of humans, it was mass gatherings of humans expressing their creativity, their humor, with art, with puppetry, with signs, with puns, all different ways saying, we are bringing our fullest selves, our creative selves, to this work. Well, that is true in every kind of movement that's effective. And one example of this in our mass popular culture is the way in which television shows like Transparent and Master of None have begun to shift our notion of what's a story of an American, right? In the case of Transparent, stories of transgender Americans, which were completely not heard or seen before, are now really quite part of the popular narrative. And they're shifting the power balance of this community. In the case of Master of None, everyday stories about young people and trying to make it in the big city, but now woven through with a multicultural approach, are also shifting our sense of who gets to tell stories in American life about claiming this country. And of course, a recent example, Lin-Manuel Miranda, the musician and the creator of Hamilton, in the wake of the devastating hurricanes in Puerto Rico, created an endeavor called Almost Like Praying, in which he wrote a song and invited artists and musicians from all over the country, Latinos especially, to join in the performance of this song. And they sold this song to raise money for the Hispanic Federation's Hurricane Relief Fund. They didn't just call for donations, they used art. They used art to activate power, to draw money power, to get people mobilized to care about and to pay attention to the devastation in Puerto Rico. Another example as well is a project we've been running at Citizen University called The Joy of Voting. The Joy of Voting is a project that says, you know, there used to be in this country a culture at the local level of joyful, raucous participation around voting and elections. Street theater, open-air debates, bonfires, parades. And that culture is something that we can rekindle if we just try it. And so we have been trying it in cities around the United States. This is an image from St. Paul, Minnesota, where street theater and puppetry was activated to get folks to come out and vote. This is a performance in Wichita, Kansas, where spoken word was used to get young people who wouldn't otherwise care about elections and voting to start showing up and thinking about how they have a role there. And by making art to make power, to shift the equation of power, you also actually remind people that as citizens, we are creators, and that there's a sense of theatricality and creativity to all performances in civic life. Well, this brings me then to the third and final dimension of performing power, and this is this idea of minority rule. Now, the United States, of course, as a democracy, always runs on the notion of majority rule. But let's remember, at every turn, majority rule is shaped by minority will. It's always an activated, highly motivated, intense and focused minority that begins to change minds and shift the hearts of the broad majority. It's usually a majority that doesn't have strong opinions about something, is just happy to drift along with the status quo. But that catalytic minority shifts the equation of power. This is true of every single social movement in American history, from suffrage to abolition to the civil rights movement to the marriage equality movement. It's always this motivated minority that gets the ball rolling. Here in Seattle, over recent months on criminal justice reform issues, a group of young activists have been organizing in ways that have been completely demonstrating the power of motivated minorities. Both the Block the Bunker movement and the No New Youth Jail movement, led by young people of color who weren't connected, who weren't part of the power structure of the city, but who began to mobilize with a fierce sense of voice, with moral clarity, showing up at meetings, changing the way people thought about these issues of whether we ought to build a lavish new North Precinct headquarters for the police department, whether we need a brand new fancy youth detention center, beginning to ask these questions that shifted people's presumptions. Now both of these projects are on hold because of this motivated minority. Another example as well is, of course, just in general voting in elections and civic life in the United States. Right now, President Trump has about a third of the public that's strongly behind him. And one way to look at that is to say, well, that's not very much. But another way to look at it is that 1/3 is with him come hell or high water. And that motivated minority, because it shows up, because it votes, because it sticks by him, has completely bent the rest of the Republican Party toward itself. And now the rest of that party, whether you like it or not, whether one thinks it's good or not, is moving toward that motivated minority. In every example, across the left and the right, Republicans and Democrats, that's how change happens. Now, to take a look at how performing power unfolds in our own community, let's look at an event called We the Public that unfolded in Westlake Plaza, organized by everyday citizens to use art to generate new power.